As Professor Fontanella already said, this paper actually draws from introduction and some of the essays that were collected in the volume Sicily, a Mediterranean Migration, Exchange, or Invention, published by Paul Grave and co-author with my colleague, Dr. Claudia Caragos of St. Louis University. Sicily as a case study was also the topic of one of the courses that I taught in spring 2015 at Auburn, which received a small grant, and thanks to the small grant, my students and I were able to go to a symposium at University of Catania, co-sponsored by the university, Auburn University, and Paris West, Nanterre. The interest in Sicily, of course, my homeland, in spite of my last name, I'm from Catania, Sicily, has been a continuous source of inspiration for me, and I'm ever so grateful to be here today, especially speaking at the end of this second day, having covered, or at least uncovered, some of several sensitive issues. At the center of Mediterranean and simultaneously part of hegemonic Europe and Occidental geopolitical formation, Sicily has been throughout history a crucial locus where civilization confronted but also transformed one another. In recent times, as a point of departure as well as of arrival and transit of massive migratory processes, Sicily continues to be a critical Mediterranean crossroads and a vital springboard for interaction, development, and dissemination of diverse cultures. Historian David Abulafia, in his introduction to Mediterranean in history, writes, and I quote, "It may be a cliché to describe islands such as Sicily as stepping stones between the different cultures of the Mediterranean world, but it is nevertheless true." End of quote. In the beginning, and this might be more for students rather than you scholars, in the beginning were the Greeks, who dominated the island for 500 years and who were followed by protagonists from 3 continents. In fact, after the Romans, for 700 years, came the Vandals and Goths from northeastern Europe, the Byzantine from westmost Asia, and then the Arabs from North Africa. After the Normans and its Europe developed nation-states, Sicily was occupied by the Spanish. The House of Savoy and Habsburg ruled it for brief periods, and then the Spanish returned as the Bourbon dynasty. Sicily holds a unique geographical position that makes it, and I quote, "the least island, like of all the Mediterranean islands, being at once too big, too close to the center of the Mediterranean and to the Italian mainland," end of quote. Moreover, the distance between the coastline of Sicily and Tunisia is only 155 kilometers, that is to say 96 miles. Quote again, "We are not south of Italy, we are north of Africa," end of quote. Sicily also bears a distinct political status within the Italian peninsula. The region was granted autonomy in May 1946 through the approval of the Sicilian Special Statutes of the Italian Constitution. This gives the island a unique power on the wide range of legislative, administrative, and financial matters. Sicily is one of only 5 Italian regions out of a total of 20 to enjoy the status of an autonomous political entity. It is important to underscore that these statutes were conferred to acknowledge the cultural differences within these regions and to protect linguistic minorities, and certainly to abate any potential separatist initiatives. And yet, as Leonardo Sciascia reminds us, in its uniqueness, Sicily, with its fantastical dimension, its fatalism, Sicilitudine, and Sicilianità, is also a metaphor. And I quote, "Cerco di far passare il cammello dell'Italia per la cruna dell'idea che ho della Sicilia. I try to thread Italy's camel through the eye of the needle of the idea I have of Sicily." End of quote. From this perspective, Sicily is a point of departure and key to national but also global ills. In presenting and reflecting on Sicily's long history and cross-cultural mediation and development in the Mediterranean regions and beyond, my goal is not to essentialize Sicilian identity, nor to propose a sort of Sicilian identitarian fundamentalism. Rather, I seek to bring to the fore the continued interconnectivity, hybridity, and relevance of a specific southern periphery of today's today's world, the Italian island region known as Sicily, and of its Mediterranean context. To that end, rather than re-examine Sicily's national and continental belonging, I want to focus on the island's connection with the peoples and the cultures of the Mediterranean. I thus look at Sicily as part of Europe's south, but also of the transactional system of peripheral others that Franco Cassano, already mentioned here, has called the global south. And I quote, "Places where for centuries civilizations have met and hung in the balance between conflict, coexistence, and contamination," end of quote. This diverse system includes not only the Mediterranean, but also regions such as the Caribbean, India, and Latin America. In his influential Pensiero Mediterraneo, Southern Thought, 1996, and later works, Cassano calls for the rethinking of the Mediterranean South as a subject rather than an object of thought, urging to see it as, and I quote, "an autonomous point of view rather than the not yet North," end of quote. Simultaneously, Cassano advocates a re-envisioning of the contemporary world as constructed by hegemonic Occidental modernity through Southern categories such as moderation, measure, and slowness. With regard to slowness, for example, he argues that only a multiplicity of times enables progress. Identifying progress solely with accelerations erases forms of experience that are precious and indispensable for mankind. Asserting the autonomy of the South thus responds to an urgent need common to Southerners and non-Southerners to interrogate Northern and Atlantic modernity by juxtaposing, and I quote, "other paths that are not delivered to the primacy of competitive obsession and the dominion of economic illusion," end of quote. For Cassano, reconsidering the Mediterranean that is regarding it with renewed appreciation and a new demarginalized gaze is a crucial step of this process. The relevance of the Mediterranean lies precisely in its status as a border, interface, and mediation among people. Following Cassano's perspective, I can propose that Sicily's past and present history as a vital locus of Mediterranean conflicts, connection, and negotiation embodies then the multiverse which constitutes the Mediterranean region. There is a plurality, and I quote, "that trains the mind to grasp the complexity of the world, hybridity, crossroads, and identity that do not love purity and cleanness, but have been mixed for a long time," end of quote. Recent studies have reevaluated the role that Sicily has played in the past because of its unique reconciliation. Scholars such as Carla Mallette, who unfortunately is not here, from the Kingdom of Sicily 2005, and M.K. Khan, The Influence of Arabic Poetry on Dante, for example, have explored the literary and linguistic transformation Sicily underwent during the 12th and 13th century. And I quote, "a revolution that remains one of the most striking and least understood chapters in medieval literary history," end of quote. As Mallette notes, the Sicilian poets both appropriated the inventions of previous vernacular poets and honed and modified them in significant ways. She also highlights another original traits of the Sicilian school, poetry written with a female voice. In Sicily, this gained particular prominence and embodied a crucial cultural shift of the era. And I quote, "the toppling of the Arabic cultural dominance that had given Sicily its cultural edge and the emerging hegemony of a Romance tongue that naturalized by the poets of the peninsula will become known as Italian," end of quote. Focusing on the Middle Ages, Sicily is a crucial case study to illustrate the web of negotiation among medieval Mediterranean culture, languages, and artistic traditions. Recent studies, again, have reevaluated the role that is played in this unique reconciliation. The Middle Ages in Sicily were undoubtedly a time of cross-cultural conflict, but also mediation and fruitful development. Building on Greek and Roman cultural and material legacy, the Muslim rulers transformed Sicily into a thriving economy based on agriculture and maritime trade. The integration of Arabs, Berbers, Africans, Greeks, Jews, Persians, and Slavs into local communities created a cosmopolitan society whose capital, Palermo, was the second largest in Europe. The Norman rule, which began with the arrival of the Normans in Sicily in 1061 and ended with the death of their descendant Frederick II in 1250, was also a brief but remarkable time in European and Mediterranean history. Although this was also a period of wars against the Muslim, and which was long and destructive, the Normans were able to incorporate the sophistication of Arab culture into their own and to sustain and even promote cultural heterogeneity. In Norman Sicily, multiple religion, linguistic, and literary tradition coexisted. Having assumed control of much of southern Italy, in Sicily, the Norman found a more sophisticated society than those that had encountered in England or even in mainland Italy. The polyglot culture of the Arab and Byzantine created a thriving intellectual, artistic, and economic environment. It was a geographical crossroads between north and south, east and west, which gave birth to new artistic and socio-political expressions. Between 1071 and 1194, in particular, the Norman Kingdom of Sicily became the most culturally advanced court in the richest country of the Mediterranean world, attracting scholars, scientists, poets, artists, and artisans. This harmonization of Arabic Sicily remained a distinguishing trait of the local culture during the reign of Frederick, who served as Holy Roman Emperor, King of Jerusalem, and King of Sicily, though, as Carla Mallette points out, and I quote, "Sicily teaches us not to oversimplify the history of cultural relations between Muslim and Christians in the borderland states of the medieval Mediterranean," end of quote. When considering the Norman age in Sicily, it's also essential to study the extraordinary art and architecture created from this amalgamation, motives that really are concluded as magical fusion of the best that each culture offered. In his La Cattedrale di Palermo, 1999, Giuseppe Bellafiore emphasized the Norman rulers' ability to accept existing architectural styles and yet maintain their ties to the homeland. The Cappella Palatina in Palermo is in fact a symbol of how the three styles, Byzantine, Arabic, and Norman, were combined to create something new, a text akin to the literary works of Sicilian poets, demonstrating how the original cultural production of Sicily during this era contributed to European modernity. Both the literature and architecture from this period indicate Sicily's evolution from a culture of assimilation to one of cross-pollination and subsequently to one of original creativity. This creativity was the product of the recognition and appreciation of diversity, which allows Sicily to dominate the Mediterranean. The impact of the intellectual fervor and cross-cultural exchange in Norman Sicily and under Frederick is also crucial from a linguistic perspective. Sicilians wrote in all three of the formal literary languages. They wrote histories of the Norman in Sicily in Latin and poetry in Arabic, while Greek was used solely by monastic communities and for religious documents. Jews who spoke Hebrew and occasionally Aramaic were employed by Frederick at court to translate Greek and Arabic works. By carrying out this intense translation task, masterly intellectual contribution from different origins spread across the Italian peninsula and became the standard textbooks in the emerging university of 12th century Europe. An overview of Sicily's history or linguistic exchanges provide a wide-angle view of the many linguistic heritage that have shaped the Sicilian language. In that period, there was not always a clear correspondence between ethnic origin, religious belief, and spoken language. For example, a Muslim convert of Sicilian background might not have spoken Arabic. Simultaneously, bilingualism was also spreading. There is also linguistic evidence of a massive romanization process between the Arabs and the Normans. The Romance dialect called the Mozarabico Siciliano by Varvaro, typical of the last phase of the Arab domination, was probably the result of the development of the late Latin language. In early modern times, Sicily's long history of cross-cultural negotiation and achievement was forgotten. However, the excavation of Herculanus and Pompeii in the early 1700s enticed the most courageous Bear leaders and their protégés to go beyond the traditional stops of the Iter Italicum of the Grand Tour, whose southernmost cities had been up to that time Rome and Naples. Until then, Sicily had only been viewed as a dangerous land full of bandits, arid terrains, and natural calamities. In the second half of the 18th century, many European naturalists, diplomats, architects, poets, and young aristocrats visited Sicily, in particular Messina, Taormina, Catania, Siracusa, Agrigento, Selinunte, Segesta, and Palermo. Sicily, finally an important stop in the Grand Tour, was perceived as a dreamland of architecture, the place in which multiple styles that we spoke about could be studied, and where a new one could be born, of natural beauty, where sea and mountains meet with vegetation vegetation and mineral resources that testify to the richness of its territory, and of cultural activities and enrichment that encompass many influence and spared new connection. Both Friedrich Maximilian Hessemer and Johann von Goethe hint to Sicily's privileged position and unique riches by calling the island, respectively, the dot on the I in Italy. The rest of the peninsula seems as a stem there to sustain this wonderful flower, and the key to everything, probably the most renowned sentence. The journey that Goethe and others after him took was meant to be a quest for knowledge and the self, and Sicily was the connector to these two worlds, clue to intellectual and spiritual awakening. Notwithstanding this crucial recovery of Sicily's unique cultural legacy, during the revolutionary decades of the 19th century, Sicilians were still seen, and I quote, as half barbarous, fiery, and passionate, end unquote. In response to such a view, Cecilia Michele Amari compiled a Storia dei Musulmani in Sicilia, a history of the Muslim in Sicily, to present Sicily as a part of Europe and of the world history, not as a land reconquered for Europe by the Normans, as Rosario Romeo claimed, but as the product of complex encounters of cultures dominated by Arab influence. Amari believed that Sicily had no reason to envy Northern Europe. Rather, owing to its Arabic heritage, Sicily had shaped the very identity of the modern West. This interpretation was soon abandoned, and I quote, the memory of the Oriental past was kept as a memento of a fundamental Sicilian imperfection that only European intervention could be capable of correcting, end of quote. Backwardness was the dominant category through which Sicilians in southern Italy were seen, a perception that, as Cassano has shown, still plagued the Mediterranean South. An overview of recent immigration to Sicily proves how the influx of immigrants from Africa and Asia in the last decades transformed Sicily once again into a multicultural region, reviving its ancient identity. Today, Sicily is the first land of reception for the men, women, and children who cross the Mediterranean Sea, braving many adversaries, oftentimes to escape war, famine, and poverty in their home countries. Migrants from the African continent, but also from Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia, have poured into Sicily. The foreign presence reached approximately 140,000 migrants on January 1st, 2011, according to Istat, a substantial increase compared to the reported 18.12% foreign population in December 2008. This rise is due in part to the pervasive financial crisis which created a culture of return migration among those who, after the arrival in Sicily, like other regions such as Campania and Apulia, continued toward more economically appealing destinations, but eventually returned to the south, where they knew they could find perhaps a more welcoming atmosphere and perhaps cheaper accommodation. Since the end of 2010, the arrests in the Middle East and North Africa have also generated a large-scale migration directed from Tunisia and Libyan shores to Sicily. Landing takes place in the tiny island of Lampedusa, which has been named several times today, and has only 6,000 inhabitants in the summertime. About daily 400 to 800 people on boats arrive in Lampedusa, where the number of migrants by May 2011 exceeded 35,000. By the end of August, 50,000 had arrived. The stream has continuously relentlessly since then, highlighting the urgent need for adequate welcoming facility to host the men, women, and children arriving. From 2011 to 2013, Lampedusa has been further affected by the tragedy of migrants swallowed by the sea while fleeing their country. For many of them, their journey of hope ended on October 3rd, 2013, when a boat carrying 500 individuals from Eritrea, Somalia, Ghana, and Sudan sank off the coast of the island. 366 joined the list of the 20,000 victims of the Mediterranean over the last 25 years. Following Campania, with its 164,268 foreigners, Sicily has the second highest foreign population in Italy. As I mentioned before, 140,000 have arrived or estimated as of 2011, but today they had just said that at least 163,000 have actually reached the shores, composed in order of size of Romanians, Tunisians, Moroccans, Sri Lankans, Albanians, Chinese, Polish, Bangladeshi, Filipinos, and Mauritians. In particular, we have a larger community of Tunisians in the Mazara del Vallo area, Chinese in Palermo and Messina, Moldavians and Russian in Catania and Messina, and Moroccan in Trapani and Ragusa. It is important here to mention the end of Mare Nostrum, and I'm talking here of the operation and not the 19th century definition, an emergency search and rescue operation implemented by the Italian government following the drowning of October 2013, and its replacement with the Triton operation financed by the EU External Borders Agency Frontex. Whereas the main goal of Mare Nostrum was to rescue migrants and refugees in international waters proactively, the Triton program, with a budget of approximately 3 million euros per month versus Mare Nostrum's 9.5 million euros monthly for Italy, focuses on border control and operates within 30 miles off the Italian coast. In October 2014, the Italian minister Angelino Alfano, a Sicilian, triumphantly declared, and I quote, "We can clearly state that Italy has fulfilled its own responsibilities," listing the achievement of Mare Nostrum during its 13 months of activity. 558 interventions with 100,250 saved individuals. On the judicial front, Mare Nostrum allowed the arrest of 728 scafisti, smugglers, and the seizings of 8 ships. End of quote. Since the operation began, the number of migrants who drowned while crossing the Mediterranean has increased, with the April 2015 Libya migrant shipwreck resulting in over 1,000 deaths alone. On the 23rd of April, a 5-hour Operation Emergency Summit was held, and EU heads of state agreed to triple the budget of Operation Triton to 120 million euro for 2015-2016. EU leaders claimed that this would allow for the same operational capacity as Operation Mare Nostrum had in 2013. And I conclude, unfortunately, because there is quite a bit to talk about, but it's probably, as you probably might wish, you have questions at the end. In Sicily, there are many local initiatives and chains of solidarity to welcome and integrate the newcomers, but we're still in great need of aid to set up appropriate infrastructure to address their necessity. The proper management of the rising phenomenon of mass migration could become a successful tool for the implementation of Mediterranean model, which combines the common histories, cultures, and tradition on both sides of the sea with innovation, competitiveness, and economic growth. The realization of this project requires not only the creation of more efficient infrastructure, but a greater number of mediators working to facilitate the integration of immigrants, but also the involvement of the countries of origin. I don't deny here that there are still many concerns about the elevated number of arrivals. As I mentioned before, from January to April 2014, 25,650 arrivals have been recorded. There are also issues of health and issues of security that the Italian government seems to have minimized consciously or not, and I am referring here to the incident reported only by UK newspapers on the 9th of November, that was the Independent, about the seizing of Tunisia Ben Nazir Meid, who was arrested in Italy in 2007, sentenced to 7 years for planning terror, and then found again amongst 200 immigrants rescued at sea by a Navy vessel on the 4th of October. Alfano continues to state that there is no proof of terrorism infiltrating these boats and remains silent, not to spread panic. I know that some of this issue will be covered tomorrow in a panel specifically on this issue. Today, Sicily continues to play the important role of metaphor, connector, mirror of the past and the present, and key to the future with major challenges and opportunities. I hope that this paper will be an inspiration to explore Sicily's complex and rich history as a locus where the coming together of diverse people, cultures, and religions has produced conflict, but also knowledge, and which continues to open novel roads of material and cultural exchange. Sicily is an invaluable chiave di lettura, an interpretative tool to understand the Mediterranean and the global South, and no time like in the present, with the urgent challenges posed by ever-increasing migratory waves from other Mediterranean shores, as Sicily's position being more crucial. Thank you.